Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Batya. On this episode, I am very pleased to have on the podcast Batya Ungar-Sargon. She is the Deputy Opinion Editor of Newsweek. She's also been the Opinion Editor of Forward, largest Jewish media outlet in the United States. She's written for many places, the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, and the New York Review of Books Daily, among with many other publications. She's appeared on numerous outlets, MSNBC, NBC, NPR, and she holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of her first book called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. I'm pretty sure I mention it early on in the conversation. You know, as I've said numerous times on the podcast, I'm quite fatigued with this topic. I'm very tired of kind of talking about woke and anti-woke and mass media, and I understand that these are things that people are going on about and they're continuing to talk about, and these are things in our society. But I do like to give my attention to other topics. And that all being said, her book was really fantastic. I can't recommend it more highly. She was very balanced, I think, in her approach of things. She gives probably the first third or first quarter of the book really just kind of a good contextual history of journalism, which I was not expecting, and I greatly appreciate it. And I think it really drives home a lot of her other points about what the current media situation is doing to us in society. In the conversation, we talk about the history of journalism and the emphasis on speaking to the working class. We talk about why mass media has split into two major polarized divisions. We tell the story of how media became for elites and by elites. We talk about some of the incentives of media and social media. We talk about some of the potential psychological explanations for some of the polarization in society. We talk about the impact of social media on media overall. We talk about some of the differences in conservative and liberal media. If I recall in this part of the conversation, her and I have a really nice back and forth about some of the differences and how conservative and liberal media are treated. We talk about briefly some of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and how challenging that's been for many, many years. And then we talk about individual journalism and, can we save some of the journalistic institutions? I have to say, I've followed Batya for a long time at Newsweek and other places. I've read her pieces, and obviously now having read her book, and she's quite sharp. I love her opinions on many things. But I have to say, she is an absolutely lovely human being. She was such a pleasure and joy to talk to, and she's a great person on many of these issues, not only with her mind, but also with kind of her spirit and her nature. And so now I bring you Batya Ungar-Sargon. I'm here with Batya Ungar-Sargon. I know I've probably messed up the pronunciation. Forgive me.
That was perfect.
How's it going?
Oh man, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very, very, very kind. The honor is all mine. You've written a book, which we'll talk about, but I've followed your work. I've read your pieces. You're an exceptional writer, really good thinker, and you're just a lovely person. So I really am happy to talk to you for as much time as you'll give me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
So tell listeners that don't know who you are, what your day job is, what your night job is, what you're doing in your off hours, what's your whole kind of gamut of the things that you're involved in.
I am the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek, where my brief is to run opinion across the political, ideological, racial, religious spectrum. We are very much opposed to cancel culture and believe that it is extremely important that people encounter points of view they disagree with in the same publication. So I am a cog in a machine that is trying our best to do that, and I'm very proud to be doing that work. Especially, I personally try my best to elevate working class voices, who, as we will, I'm sure, get to over the next hour, I believe have been deplatformed from American journalism. And I guess in my free time, I write books. I wrote a book called Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. It's out October 26th. And I was so pleased to hear that you enjoyed it. So thank you so much for reading it.
Yeah, no, I really had a good time reading it. Is this your first book, or like officially, or have you written other stuff? I don't know.
Book, yeah.
Is it your first? Okay. Yeah.
I have written a few detective novels, but
very nice.
They're not very good. So
I haven't read those, but I should definitely read those as well.
They're not published.
Yeah, I'll say that the book is, I mean, I've said this plenty of times on the podcast at this point. Most people know this. I'm pretty fatigued with conversations about woke culture and media and all these things, and I just feel like people's agendas come out and all this stuff, which is fine. People can do that, but I'm just kind of bored with it. And this book doesn't do any of that, which was so nice. I really had no expectations reading it. I was like, okay, I'll read this. I'll read pretty much anything, and so. It was a really pleasant surprise for me, and so I can't highly recommend it enough to have a kind of balanced, nuanced approach to many of the things going on in society at the moment. So it's great. Yep, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. It's fantastic and out shortly. So, all right. So in the book, you start by talking about the history of journalism, which was surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that when I read it. I thought you were just going to jump right to the meat of it. And so I said, oh, she's really building here. Okay, this is cool, And so you tell the story of how basically journalism's audience has gone from working class folks to elite class. And this is something that I think maybe other people have picked up on as well in other contexts, but you're kind of framing it within a journalistic piece of it. So maybe just give us the kind of overview or the arc of how we went from that, and from newspapers and various media outlets went from talking to or speaking to kind of your everyday kinds of folks to now where it's at the kind of beholden to what elites dictate and how they want things and all that, and why some of that has kind of evolved in that way.
So I wanted to understand what was going wrong with our media. And so I sort of started looking back through the history of American journalism. And what I found was there was a populist American journalism in the 19th century, a model of journalism that has disappeared, as you described. It started with this guy called Benjamin Day, who arrived in New York City in 1829, and he was a printer. His father had apprenticed him out to a printer when he was 14 years old. Like, many people at the time, he did not have a high school education. And what he found when he got to New York was that all of the newspapers were geared towards the elites, either the political elites or the economic elites. And he kind of, while working next to another printer, together they came up with this idea of like, well, what if there was a paper that spoke to the poor and the working classes? They kind of thought to themselves like, okay, well, the papers for the elites are extremely expensive, right? They're geared towards the elites, both in terms of the cost and in terms of what's inside of them. They could not possibly interest anybody who wasn't in those, elites. And they thought, but there are so many poor and working class people. Like, surely if you had something that was worth their money, worth them parting with some smaller amount of money, you could still make it because there are so many of them. And that's exactly what he did. He started the penny press. instead of a newspaper costing, a yearly subscription of $10, which was like an astronomical sum at the time, he said, I'm going to sell these newspapers on the streets and I'm going to sell them for a penny. And he instantly became this like huge success because the poor and working class in America were literate, which was also very unique at the time. There was a very high literacy rate. And he realized very early on that the way you get people to part with a penny when maybe they only have 2 pennies is by giving them something relevant to their life. So he sent this reporter to go and sit in the daybreak courts, and he would take down all of the stories. I mean, I think he embellished a little bit. He was an amazing writer. And he would just talk about who he saw in the daybreak courts, who the police were bringing in, what their crimes were. Essentially, he was gossiping about the poor and the working classes. He made them worthy of being gossiped about, and they ate that up. They were so excited to see themselves represented in these pages. Day became very, very wealthy off of the pennies of these poor and working class New Yorkers. And he started a revolution. He was copied almost instantly, even by the people who were, detracting him and calling him, smutty and sensationalist and whatever. And he also took up as a crusade the cause of the working classes. He would print, union calls for revolution in full and demands. And he would cover, the need for reform in labor. And he would just really was on their side. And so I often say, the problem with our press today is not that it's partisan. It's who it's partisan for. Benjamin Day's paper was partisan too, but it was partisan for the poor. It was on their side, So he was then copied by a whole bunch of people, including Joseph Pulitzer, who's, the World became the most widely read newspaper in the entire world. And he also felt that the paper should be a crusade on behalf of the poor, but also something that was consumed by them. He didn't want to preach to them or about them. He wanted them to be his customers. And I think that there's like a real dignity in that, like in saying to somebody who maybe has 2 pennies, I have something that's worth one of them. I'm not going to give it to you. It's not charity. I'm not going to speak to other elites about how we need to care about you. I'm going to speak to you, and I'm going to make something that's worth your money. So it was a populist revolution on behalf of the poor and working classes that was taking place through American journalism. Now, at the same time as Pulitzer was becoming incredibly wealthy off of the pennies of American poor, there was a counter-revolution to his revolution, like a counter-reformation, where, another newspaper emerged that realized, okay, I can't compete with Joseph Pulitzer in numbers because he's got a lock on that, poor and working class readership. What I can do is, if I can convince an advertiser that only rich people are reading my paper, then that ad will become worth so much more money, right? Like, let's say somebody's paying, at the time, let's say they were going to pay $100 for an ad, right? If that ad was going to be seen by 100,000 people and 95,000 of them were poor or working class and couldn't afford the thing the ad was advertising, then they're only advertising to 5,000 people and they're paying a lot for that. But if you could say to them, okay, I'm never going to get 100,000 people to look at your ad. I am going to get 25,000 people to look at it, but they're all going to be rich and they're all going to be in the market for an expensive watch. That ad is suddenly worth a lot more. Now, the person who figured out that was Henry Jarvis, and he was the guy who started the New York Times. And that was the model the New York Times initially began on. It was, let's have a more elite clientele and signal to that clientele, to our readership, that they are elites through the content, through a sort of higher class content. They still did not go back to the elites of the pre-penny press. They still were charging just 1 or 2 pennies for the paper, but the content, the articles signaled to advertisers who the readers were. So you had these sort of 2 models for journalism. And sadly, what happened over the course of the 20th century was the Benjamin Day and Joseph Pulitzer model evaporated. And now all media has leaned into the New York Times model, essentially, except for conservative media, which is, its own block. But the liberal media, by and large, has leaned into that model. Everybody now is going for the same elite clientele. So how and why did that happen? There's a number of reasons it happened. So the first reason is that there was a status revolution among journalists themselves. So Pulitzer and Day both came from poor backgrounds. They were not. Pulitzer himself was homeless for a long time after he was conscripted. He fought in the Civil War, and then he was homeless when he came to New York City. Like they had both experienced being destitute. Today, journalists, by and large, come from the elite of America. And that happened for a number of reasons. So, for example, television is one reason it happened, right? In 1964 was the first year that the majority of Americans said they got their news from TV. Well, if you can turn on the TV and literally see and hear the immediacy of what's happening around the world, for a newspaper to just tell you what happened, it's not going to be great competition, right? So newspapers started to realize they had to become interpretive. They had to add something in addition to just telling you what happened. Another thing that happened was, Woodward and Bernstein, right? They took on the president, who was the most unpopular person in America, and they won. And then it was sort of memorialized in TV, in the movie version, right? And you had these like sexy sex pots like running out there and, doing something, very noble. And so a higher, people who were in college who would have maybe gone on into politics or gone into other sort of elite professions suddenly started to see journalism as something that was sort of, you could become famous, you could become an important person, right? And as sort of more highly educated people applied to be journalists, they wanted more money for the job. The job started to pay a little bit more, not a lot more, but a little bit more. And that really started to shift over time as with the digital revolution and the collapse of local media. As local media collapsed, journalism became really something that took place like on the coasts, where you have highly educated liberal elites living. And a survey from 2016 found that journalists not only lived primarily in pro-Clinton areas, but they lived in the most pro-Clinton areas. So as America has sorted itself into blue and red states, blue and red districts, blue and red counties, journalists ended up in the bluest of the blue, essentially. And as the industry constricted, the jobs that remained were more elite and paid a lot more. And so if it used to be that a journalist, living next door to a cop, right, made a little bit more than his neighbor, the cop, today a journalist, is living in Park Slope and he's making a little bit less than his neighbor, the lawyer, right? There was just a status revolution. To become a journalist today, you have to take unpaid internships in college, which means anybody who's working their way through college really can't become a journalist. To make the connections you need in this tiny industry, you have to go to one of these graduate programs that cost $70,000 a year. You have to live in New York City or San Francisco or one of these, cities that is just extremely expensive, often on an internship that pays $1,000 maybe for a whole summer. I mean, it's really a rich kid's position. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some working class people who make their way in. There are, but they're really the exceptions that prove the rule. There's been a huge status revolution. And along with the status revolution of journalists has been a shift in who they see as their audience. And really that working class and poor audience has fallen by the wayside for all of these pressures, but also the same reasons that Democrats overall have been sort of really gearing their message more towards highly educated elites over time. So in short, I know that wasn't very short, but a brief history of how journalism lost the working class audience it once had and took pride in.
Yeah, it's a very nice overview. I think that there's a few things that jump out to me about that. So it seems that there's a kind of a partitioning of sorts of we're always being pulled or gravitating towards polarities. Yeah. There's elite and working class. Well, I'm sure that there's many people that don't fit into any of those categories, right? At all points in United States history, which can be odd for some people, right? It's like, well, I'm not, I'm not working in a factory mill, but I'm also not, on Fifth Avenue. I'm just kind of somewhere in between. That can be interesting in who's talking to people sort of that kind of don't fit into one of these two camps. And I think you could just trace that at any point in history. But also, people will, I believe this happened a lot during the 2016 campaign and definitely last year, where people were kept saying this element of, there's two things. It was media in general, mass media. We'll say journalism, but it's branched out into many components now. Is so polarized. It's so polarized, and everyone. Media is everyone's punching bag, which it has its faults for sure. But when I casually like reading history, and so since the beginning of the nation's founding, we always have this polarity of different sides, right? One of two major parties. There was a book written, forgetting who wrote it at the moment, was Lincoln and the Power of the Press. I can't remember the author. It was a good book, and it talked about how absolutely polarized the press was during the Civil War, and how they were talking about the events that were happening in the North and the South. I mean, it's like you lived in two different countries if you read one paper and the other. And not only was it polarized, it was obviously so. Like, everybody knew that's what it was. There was no like, oh, we're trying to be objective. It was, this is, if you're on the Republicans or them, this is the paper you read. Like, that's just how it was. There wasn't a, oh, we're going to try and be neutral and objective. And that didn't exist. It didn't need to, right? And so it kind of in the timeline of what you were first saying with Pulitzer and Day, that kind of offshoot, I would say, after that is like, okay, how can we then make it where it's not this way, where we can just have the average day kinds of folks do that? And then obviously Kearns Goodwin wrote the really big monster book, The Bully Pulpit.
Yeah, Team of Rivals. She also talks about the newspaper there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story about there's always a, which of course, right, is a for political parties or candidates or presidents, how much do you use the press, for persuasion of certain things, but not too much where it becomes propaganda. And that is a very hard, I guess, line to walk. And you have to, in The Bully Pulpit, she talks about how Teddy Roosevelt did that very well. Maybe one of the best presidents to do that in many, many, many years. But there's some ethics to it that's kind of ambiguous. And so it just seems to me that there's always a kind of splintering into two camps of sorts. Do you see it that way, that there's always, no matter which way we slice it, there's always going to be two camps? In this scenario, you're saying working class elites, or not? Is there more factions? And if so, if you do think it's just the two, why is that? Or why is it? Because we need certain villains, or we need somebody that's opposing? Or what do you make of the kind of splintering into these two camps? And what about everyone else that doesn't fit into one of those categories?
At the turn of the century, there were so many newspapers in America. There were, I think, like 4 or 5 communist newspapers in New York City alone. And like, they were all communists, but like they would sooner shoot one of their rivals than read their paper, right? Like, right? Like, I don't think that the partisanship in information is really a problem at all. Like, I just, to me, it's like a class question masquerading as one about truth. You have the like Vox model where it's like, very much in the Obama model of like, oh, if only everybody was educated, everyone would agree. And I'm like, no, I actually believe in democracy. Like, I actually believe a healthy democracy will have, the ideal democracy will have people who are pro-life and pro-choice. And it's amazing to me that it's the liberals who are supposed to be on the side of debate and discourse and tolerance. They cannot imagine an ideal world in which there are people who disagree with them on important issues. It's very, very strange. Like, the idea that somehow, like, people who are pro-choice and pro-life are not debating information, they're debating values, right? And that is a good thing. Like, we should be debating values, and sometimes we should lose and sometimes we should win. But I think that there's this impulse right now on the left to portray anybody who disagrees as like evil and hopelessly uninformed, and to cast and that to me is very much about whether you have a college degree or not, whether or not you speak about information in this very circumscribed way or not, in this very elite way that is really about deplatforming people who disagree with you. So I really disagree with that. we are very polarized today, but I have to say, like the Trumpiest people I know feel very alienated from Fox News and very alienated from mainline Republicans, very alienated from Mitch McConnell, and the lefties that I know feel extremely alienated from the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I'm not even sure that we are in a moment of like duality. Like I don't know that that's the case. Like I don't know. Like does like do the people who love, Josh Hawley really have anything in common with the people who love Mitch McConnell? I don't know. Like it's, like Hawley's a populist, right? Like and so I think like that was, to me, what was really disappointing was like Trump was very much an economic populist. A lot of his economic agenda was stuff that Bernie Sanders was pushing in 2015, like as recently as 2015. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me there was sort of like a choice like that Democrats could have been like, you know what? Yeah, he's gross. He's gross. But look, he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. We hate NAFTA. He wants to make a trade war with China. We think we need to do that. This is all important stuff. We're going to support him on this stuff. And I feel like they could have gotten so far because he was a man who would literally give away a kidney to be praised on cable TV. You know what I mean? Like this is a man who would do anything to be praised. And instead, they sort of leaned in on what was very much a class question, which was his aesthetics, which of course were disgusting. You know what I mean? But was that really worth So to me, it's like whose fault is it that economics have disappeared from the agenda and we're all in on culture wars? We're all complicit in that, even I, like, my book is about, right, like how we abandon economic platforms for a culture war, right? Like it's a lot sexier to talk about. Okay, your question was about the polarity. I don't know if I answered it, but I don't think I have anything else interesting to say about it.
No, you did. Well, it leads up to my kind of follow-up. In the beginning, you talk about there's a question that Thomas Frank poses about why working class people vote for Republicans and not for Democrats. I talked to Rick Perlstein a while ago, and he wrote that kind of 4-volume arc, Nixon land, Reagan land, Visible Bridge, Before the Storm. And we talked about this, and in his book and in the conversation, he basically says that people turned on the party, kind of the New Deal Democrats from FDR, for more of the conservative populism of Goldwater and Nixon and then Reagan because of this. Basically, there was this kind of and the way he tells it is this kind of tsunami of sorts of after World War II, and you had the New Deal Democrats, you had so much growth, you had so many, for some groups of folks, from 1950 to 1970, the best economy in the United States, et cetera, all that stuff. And it kind of created a new elite class at that point. Like it really created an elite class. And at a certain point, the working class said, well, wait a minute, we're kind of getting left behind here. And the villain that needed to be had was, well, we don't want elites here. And so now we're going to talk, listen to the people that are doing this kind of populism to say, well, we're not going to forget about the little guy, or we're not going to forget about the coal miner or the factory worker or whatever, 60s and 70s. And that was the kind of, answer that, Perlstein in his mind, believes why someone like Goldwater, I mean, he got slaughtered politically in 1964, but, he got some movement, and then it carried, building. That's why Nixon won twice, partly because, Vietnam and stuff. And then that's why Reagan won twice. And then there was a shift of, okay, how do we as Republicans, the Republican Party, we don't have to worry about economics anymore. There's a lot of, they did not get a lot of political wins in many ways. And so what they did was they shifted to kind of culture wars. And this is where you see, in the Reagan era, war on drugs and, family values and very pro-life. And that's fine. But the fact that they were capitalizing on that politically to really make that part of the political structure for their party, you see this kind of morphing and evolving that happens for both sides. And so now we're in this situation where, just as you detail it as well, is we have this kind of big chasm of everyday working class people and elites, whether that's in various forms of journalism or mass media, whether that's with politicians, with certain writers, and now it's become, well, these people have nothing to do with my everyday kind of life. They can't relate to me. They don't understand me. And so just I have a follow up to that, but my question there is, what do you think about that kind of answer of this kind of evolution from, politically at least, working class to then this elitism to having these kind of proverbial villains and things like that of the elite class, as far as why that's mapped onto how certain parties have done things over the past 55, 60 years?
I guess I see it a little bit differently, which is that, like 50, 60 years ago, you had two parties. You had the Republicans who represented the rich, and then you had the Democrats who represented the poor and the working class, right? And labor and the middle class. And, over the last 50 years, basically you've had a shift on, the Democratic side, where it's been sort of leaning into college educated voters, right? And you can see this in the districts that, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden won compared to the ones that Trump did, and then earlier Republicans. And at the same time, the sort of information job, intellectual, college educated elite became rich. And I think that is a thing that gets left out a lot. Like, it's weird to be like, it's like that thing that I talk about in my book, how journalists went from being like working class to being in the top 10%.
Right.
And that was not just journalists, anyone who was like smart, like due to all of these like meritocracy programs, right? Who was in middle America, getting bullied by, like average people who are going to end up like, working at the factory. They, got the hell out of Dodge, got a college education and then moved to like New York or DC or San Francisco, right? And suddenly they are making a lot more money. And I think that, class in America is very interesting because it is about income, but it's also not about income. It's about education. It's about lifestyle. It's about a lot of different things. But the Democrats really leaned into those college educated voters, especially now when they see that working class voters of color are defecting to the Republicans, which is making them amp up all of the stuff that those voters are not interested in, like open borders policies, defund the police policies, environmentalism, all of these things that are, that flatter the vanity of highly educated elites and are essentially a tax on the working class. And so, of course, now you're seeing Republicans making, quote unquote, a play for those voters. But really, it's so funny. They have a huge opportunity here. All they have to do is not be crazy and they will get all of those voters. Of course, they can't. They have to be just as crazy as the left. And so they're sort of becoming just as crazy as the left, with their own culture war things. I think, to me, what's really interesting is that, so the Republicans never cared about the economic fate of the working class. The Democrats were supposed to, right? To me, it's very clear that they abandoned that platform a long time ago, through Clinton, through Obama, NAFTA, all of, globalization, exporting jobs to China, all of this stuff where nobody stood up and said, wait a minute, these are jobs for, they were like, no, let's talk about GDP, like, let's talk about the fates of elites, whatever it is. But the thing about, the thing is that, so both parties now have abandoned the working class, right? You now used to have one party representing the rich and one party representing, the poor and the working class and the middle class. Now you have one party representing the rich and one party representing the highly educated rich, right? Which is sort of that sort of side of the elites, and nobody representing 90% of Americans. But here's the thing that really I think is important is like, at least the Republicans don't sneer at their values while abandoning them. At least they don't talk as though like their abandonment is a social justice platform. That is the thing that I think is really happening right now across the media that I find really, really, that's why I wrote this book. Like, to have a CNN host who makes $1 million a year sitting there sneering at people who have lost on every front and calling them racist so that they don't have to listen to their complaints. Like, to me, that is in a nutshell, that is what we're really seeing. And it really is not just the media. It really is like across that sort of these far left ideas on identity have replaced a conversation that we have to be having about this class chasm in America. income inequality that is just disgusting and rampant. But that whole conversation has been shelved because it's so much easier to talk about race because you can't actually do anything about your race except feel guilty, and liberal elites just love feeling guilty, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of actually like doing anything, they have replaced it with a conversation that absolves them of the need to do anything, even as it insults them in the most horrific terms, like calling them white supremacists or whatever it is. I forgot what your question is.
No, I was just asking about the whole idea of the shift from working class to elites. And I do agree with.
Let me just put a pin on that. Like so yes, Fox News is representing Republican elites from an economic point of view. They do not represent working class people like from an economic point of view. But at least they don't sneer at their values. They represent them culturally. They respect their values. They respect where they're coming from. Whereas when you turn on CNN, you have a bunch of elites talking to another bunch of elites, sneering at the very people that they are acting like they're representing.
So I agree with much of that. I guess I have a bunch of questions off of this. So the first question is, okay, why do the two major parties in the United States have abandoned economic issues for the most part as a central? I mean, they might do some pandering to it, during an election, but for the most part, it's all, or much of it is culture wars stuff. It's a moral panic or moral superiority, of trying to not only having, it's not enough to have, here's our values, it's here's our values and everyone else should believe this way because they're right, obviously. There's a lot of play with all of these things. And I think there's a place for those conversations: morals, values, ethics, culture, etc. But is it just the fact that economics and the economic classes of people, that's abandoned because it doesn't win you campaigns, or is it because there's no incentives anymore to talk about those things, right? You're going to get more clicks, more listens, more viewership if you're talking about how much you hate the other side or how right you are about something in regards to, culture wars things. Is it just that it doesn't win campaigns and there's no incentives, or is it there's something else more nefarious going on both sides?
So I think one of the things I struggle with most is remembering something very, very important, which is everybody thinks they're doing the right thing. Like right. Nobody is showing up to Washington or showing up to work as a journalist and thinking, I'm going to screw over the working class, right?
Right.
Like, and that is something that my friends are always reminding me, like, Batya, you cannot speak as though it's not nefarious, I don't think. Mm-hmm. I believe truly that every single one of these people who has led to this, what I consider to be an oligarchy in America, a disaster for our democracy and a disaster for our nation, has done so on the road to hell paved with good intentions. Mm-hmm. I don't think a single person or a very few people who are like calling people racist and getting them fired for things that are like obviously not racist at all. Like, I don't think they're doing it out of like a power grab. Mm-hmm. But that is what's happening. They are consolidating power. So I think, it seems to me that it's very hard to question your own biases. It's very hard to relinquish power. And it's very hard to resist the urge to tweet things that are going to get retweeted by famous people with approbation. And I think I think people like how wonderful for someone, how wonderful it would be if the thing, like I'm trying to phrase this in the right way, like I don't think they purposely are trying to grab power, but I do think that the end result has been as part of like the squeeze, the great American squeeze, right? Where some people like information age jobs, journalism jobs were squeezed to the elites and others were squeezed out of the middle class, right? Like, I think that if you're a journalist, and you're writing about like moral panic around race, and you realize that that's what people are responding to, like that's going to go viral on Twitter, and racism is bad objectively, and there still is racism in America, it takes a lot to be like, wait a minute, but maybe the way that I'm focusing on it is actually hiding the solutions to the very problem of racism and to the problem of class and to the problem of income inequality. Like I think that is very hard to do, precisely because these people think what they're doing is the right thing. And that is something that I'm stressing here, because I have to tell myself that every day, because I think it's true, but because it is so ugly what has happened, the culture leaning all in on elites under the guise of social justice. Like, it's so ugly, but I think you can't fix it if you don't understand that they really think what they're doing is the right thing. Like, nobody's out there nefariously trying to, silence the working class. Like, they think they're representing another marginalized, vulnerable community. And I think that the category error, they don't realize that working class people of color are much more conservative than, elites and highly educated, people who come out of Harvard and Yale and Princeton, who get all of the jobs at, all the journalism jobs. They're much more like working class white people in so many of their values. And so it's really like both sides have been deplatformed, have been silenced. There is only room in the American public sphere for elites on both sides. And I think that is a disaster for democracy. That is not a democracy.
Yeah. I would agree with you there. I think that it's one of those things where maybe you're not saying this, so you tell me if I'm wrong here. You're seeming to put the responsibility on each person to exercise some type of self-control, to not feed into this kind of
okay, so I'm glad you said that, because I want to just clarify that, and then I actually want to hear what you think about this, because it's very interesting to me.
Yeah.
I think what social media did was, so journalists have always been liberal. Like, we have surveys of journalists, opinion going back, decades. They've always been more liberal, in fact, much more liberal than, the American population writ large. Mm-hmm. What used to be, though, is there was a countervailing force to the inherent liberalism of a person who wanted to be a journalism, which was the business side of journalism. Which, let's say you worked at a newspaper. Most newspapers were not, in New York City. They were like across the country. You would have a lot of towns that were one paper towns, and they had to appeal to everybody in that town, right? So they couldn't talk about a Republican president and sneer in their copy, because they would lose half the town. Compound that with the fact that their boss was probably the head of a corporation, so he was conservative and probably Republican, right? So you had a countervailing force to the journalist's own desire to represent who they considered to be the, the little guy, right? Now that countervailing force has disappeared. Social media has made it such that the business side of things and the journalist's own desire to go viral are now aligned, and they're aligned on the side of pulling to the extreme, right? Because success now in journalism is measured in terms of engagement for digital journalism, which is most of journalism right now. And engagement, as I'm sure as somebody who, puts things on the internet, that the most engaged readers and viewers are going to be the most extreme ones. Yes. And that is a business rationale, but it's one that is mimicked in the heart and soul of every journalist every time she posts an article on Twitter. Like, we know what's going to go viral. Yeah. We know what's going to get your story to the top of the board. Mm-hmm. And the CEOs are not standing up to it, because their job is to, I guess they see their job as, the business motive, right? Mm-hmm. And so the problem now is that the business motive and the journalism, the measure of journalistic success, are all pushing towards extremity, but not crucially extremity on, I would be thrilled if I'm a socialist, right? Like, I'd be thrilled if they were pulling in the extreme of like wealth redistribution. It's not going in that direction. It's only on issues of identity that require nothing from elites to give up. So I just wanted to make that point. Now, what I want to ask you is, so to me, I made a hypothesis about why they're doing this. My hypothesis is that, for liberal elites, it's much more convenient to focus on race than on class, because it absolves them of the need to relinquish any of their power. It's about money, but it's also about power. And I'm not, I have to say, like, if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not entirely satisfied with my own explanation, because to me, as somebody who was very woke and who was in that model, that I never thought, oh, I'm going to get power by doing this. I thought, like, I'm defending, the most disenfranchised here. And I just couldn't see that that was not the case, that literally the opposite was the case. I was pushing my own economic agenda in doing that. I want to know how you see it. Like, how do you interpret the psychological side of this, where you have people who have extreme amounts of power, like the most powerful journalists in the world, who are out there on Twitter, who feel like they are like the disempowered and the disenfranchised, and are actually, to my mind, perpetrating inequality by moving the conversation to something totally different. Like, what is going on there from a psychological point of view? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So my caveat is it's very complicated. It's very nuanced. Humans and human behavior we're learning so much about that all the time. And the more we learn, the more we just learn how multivariate it is. There's so many things going on. But that aside, or that out in front first, my reading of some of this stuff of what you're bringing up is, I think that most people are very lonely, and we have a natural pull as humans, as social mammals, to belong. We understand this and know this. Many people have done research on this in the psychological literature now for 35, 40 years. And, so the need to belong is huge, right? We need to belong, and we create, certain groups and tribes and things like that. But as we evolve in different clusters, if you will, we have the family, we have community, we have nation states or cities, etc. And then it continues to splinter off even more. What kind of friends you have, who are your acquaintances, colleagues, etc. If people don't feel like they belong, they will seek ways to do that. And there's no more inspiring force to do that than to have some way to have influence, power, connection, and that you can feel that you're not alone, that you can feel you have value. And I think a lot of the times when I see folks on different sides is, I see it as, what is the underlying emotional need here that is left wanting? And I think it's that. It's when people say certain things, they have a lot of pain, they have a lot of hurt. That does not make their behavior excusable sometimes or many times, but I do think it helps us understand. And so how do we have compassion for their humanity and for their in my view, their emotional pain? I think you could see this in a variety of ways. You could see this in a diagnostically or clinical, some type of trauma or some type of abuse or some type of, okay, that's fine. I mean, that's not fine, but I'm just saying you could see it in a clinical way. But I don't think you have to have that to still feel alone. I mean, it's well documented, right? That, you could be in a room with people and still feel alone, right? And people feel that. You could have it in a more acute sense, right? And, just in this moment, and then you don't. You could have it in a more chronic sense. You could have it in a clinical sense. But I do think that is something that we, as each individual human, wrestles with, is this aspect of loneliness, and maybe we don't connect or we don't fit in. And But what does that mean? So if you go one layer next, right, and deeper, what happens when you feel alone, or what happens when you don't belong? Well, I think that people you only have one person to think about and contemplate when you're alone, whether that's internally or actually, and that's yourself.
Ooh.
And the hardest thing for people is to sit with themselves and to accept who they are. And who we are is all kinds of fucked up and all kinds of beautiful. And it's hard to really parse those two out sometimes. It's hard to know that we have both of those things, or the potential for both of those things. And so I think people are going around and doing many things, signaling, trying to show their alignments or their who they're engaged with, who their crew is, or who their tribe is, or who they belong to. Because in my view, it's a long-term distraction from trying to understand who they really are, and understanding the ugly, understanding the things we don't like about ourselves, and not accepting that. And my solution for that is, well, we don't do that. We take the hard road of trying to sit with the things about ourselves that we're not proud of, or the things we don't like, and we accept that. We improve on the ways in which we can improve, and try to flourish in ways that we can flourish, uncover more aspects of who we are. And then we have, I think, different interactions with people. We are always going to want to belong. I have that feeling, I want to belong with my family or my friends or, my peers, but I don't need it to be something where it's defining of my sense of self. Mm-hmm. And if I don't have that, then I don't know who I am, or it doesn't give me purpose, or doesn't give me. And so I think sometimes people have this unbeknownst to them consciously, this craving for certain, when you talk about journalists that want certain types of power or influence, or, I think it's because there's some meaning or value that's devoid for their lives, and that gives them the short-term piece of that. And, it takes a lot of counterintuitive declining of that. Why would you decline something that's going to be momentarily rewarding? Well, because long term it's not really nourishing me, right? It's McDonald's, right? It's it fills you up, but it's not nutrients, or it doesn't give you nutrients, and we need something that's going to make us live longer and be better people for other people. And so that's kind of my rough sketch of how I conceptualize all of it. I don't know what your thoughts are, but
it's so sad. Oh my God.
It makes you look at things a little bit differently. I'm sure we follow some of the same people or see some of the same things, and they can be very intelligent, bright people, very influential people. And I look at it and I might roll my eyes, or I might get frustrated as well. And then I push past that and I say, yeah, I wonder what's going on for them. Where's this coming from? Like, where are they? Who hurt them? Or where did someone, really, have an indiscretion towards them, and they just haven't dealt with it. And that's not always the case, but in the conversations I've had with people, when I get them one-on-one and they open up a little bit, that usually comes out somewhere. Mm-hmm. And it just makes you see it differently. Yeah. Not to have pity, but really compassion, and then to say, okay, how can I be a powerful point, a positive point for this person, if anything else, in the day. And that's very hard to do when everything else that's incentivized is, who's your enemy, and, which side are you on, and, what position do you hold, and, why the other person sucks. And, I think that's, it's hard to resist that. And, and even me included sometimes. I try really hard, but sometimes I slip up, but it's hard. I think it's really, really difficult. But I think that's my short answer is, I think people are afraid of themselves. They have this inherent need to belong. And so we're taking all the shortcuts, the heuristics, to try and get that a lot of times. And it doesn't matter who you are. We're all human, right? So powerful people, influential people, smart people, intelligent people, whatever, academics, we're all susceptible to that. And to be a better human is to kind of go through that appropriately and to come out of it in a more positive way. But, that's a hard deal to make with oneself. And so, we don't see that a lot. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
No, it's a really sad answer, but it's an answer.
Yeah, I don't know if people agree with it or like it, but that's how I see it. I might change my mind, but okay. So we've talked a little bit about some of the historical stuff, and so now kind of just to the more modern stuff, which we've already been talking about. So we can kind of drive this home here. So we already mentioned this, but the impact of social media on journalism, and first off, what do you think is the biggest implication of social media for journalism? Right, so I can remember a time, you can remember a time where journalism was newspapers, radio, and television, and that was it, right? Now that's not the case, right? It's kind of the opposite of that. So what do you think is the biggest implication of social media for journalism? And then is it really pushing us to siloing ourselves with our echo chambers where we're just, everything's all confirmation bias? I'm just going to listen to the people that I like and all that kinds of stuff. How do you just see all of that?
So I think the biggest implication has been that shift from, journalists used to write to impress each other and their bosses, and now they write to get the most engagement, and the most engaged are always the most extreme. And so if you're measuring success that way, you are essentially outsourcing the moral and journalistic arbiter of what makes for good journalism, right? The authority has been outsourced to the worst place on the planet, which is the internet, and the worst place on the internet, which is Twitter. So I think that is really problematic. I have to say, I think if the New York Times had stood up and said, we're not doing this, we know what good journalism is, and we're not going to allow the worst place on the planet to tell us what that is, I don't know that it would have mattered so much that Vox was doing this. I think it's really the capitulation of the titans of the industry, which represent a much larger share of the industry because it's contracted so much, and of the adults in the room. Like I said, young journalists are supposed to be crusaders, are supposed to be, young people are supposed to be wrong about things. They're supposed to have elders in the room who stand up to them and say, no, we're not going to do that. And what happened was the elders in the room were like, oh God, if I say no, I'll get called a racist. So I better go with this. I better fire this guy because someone in the newsroom doesn't like them and they're making a stink on Twitter. You know what I mean? So I think that's been the biggest, from just a journalistic point of view, the ability to know exactly how many clicks a story is getting, exactly how it's being shared. That has been really changed the metric of success, let's say, and in favor of the extremes on both sides.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's become more difficult to find outlets or journalism where there isn't that going on. You can certainly find it in some places, but
I'll tell you who's not doing that is Fox News, because their viewership is older and is not online and is working class. Only 25% of Fox viewers has a college degree. And so their older working class, not online viewership is getting treated to kind of like old school journalism in a way. And, like I said before, I don't think Fox has a captive working class audience, and it could very easily be pushing their economic interests. I think it's terrible that they're not, but I really admire the fact that they have retained that audience. Everything you see on Fox is geared towards a working class person. That is the major difference between Fox and CNN. It's whether or not the viewer, that every single person producing every piece of content, whether the viewer that all of those people are picturing has a college degree or not. And it's not, it's not Fox's fault that those people were abandoned by everybody else. And so you'll see in the New York Times articles that are like, Fox News ate my mother's brain, or like, Fox News is turning my mom conservative. It's like, no, Fox News is conservative because it is catering to the working class, and the working class has conservative values. So 36% of Black people get their news from Fox, but only 12% of them will go to the New York Times, because that's not their values. Like, they don't believe in defunding the police, but that's all you'll read in the New York Times. They didn't have a single piece being like, defund the police. That's crazy talk. 81% of Black people want the same amount of police in our neighborhoods or more. Like, not one person like that.
Yeah. Well, let me see here. Let me see if I can slightly push back on this. So on the Fox News piece, I agree with you mostly. I do think that there are some particular hour segments that are not doing that. Look, if you turn on an hour of Tucker Carlson or whatever,
So I'm talking, yeah. So I watch Fox and CNN all day. I have both of them up, and I'm watching like the news during the day. I think so about Tucker. It's very interesting because on the one hand, yes, it's like all culture wars. It's very divisive. There's something about it that I think he goes too far. On the other hand, he's one of the few voices on the right and the center left that ever applauds economic populism. Like, he had Trump's back on economic populist issues, and he's one of the few people who did. And so I would be more full-throated in my condemnation if the only place to get a pro-economic populist point of view in the mainstream media wasn't Tucker Carlson. You know what I mean? It's not like you're getting that on CNN or MSNBC. You're getting Russiagate, right? So you're right. It's like the nighttime shows on Fox are nuts, you know?
Yeah, you could look at Gutfeld as the same, although not as, extreme. I think Hannity, I don't know if he's still on there when he was on there. I mean, there's been a handful. Yes, you're right. Like, Fox and Friends in the morning is not that way.
Better,
Yeah, no. So that's what I'm saying. I agree with you.
Right.
In the abstract, I agree with you. Yes, if you look daytime, in the morning, I agree. I think it is probably to like kind of the working class folks, more or less. But I do think that there are powerful figures that get significant prime-time airing that is all culture wars in the most non-apologetic and very deceptive ways. I think they're not having. I don't see them as good faith actors in a lot of ways. Now, let me give my counter. My counter is the New York Times or Washington Post. Look. Personally, I think their op-ed sections are an absolute travesty. I sometimes cannot believe some of the absolute fucking bullshit that I read on the op-ed sections of these papers. And how did this get out of the edit room? Like, I just don't understand it. However, there is, I think, for much now where I'm crossing media, right? Because one's TV, one's publication, but okay. I can read many New York Times articles that are fine. Like, if I look at the major sections and they're reporting the news, there's a bias, which I want to ask you about in a minute, but there's certainly a bias. It's center left or progressive left or somewhere in between, fine. But they're reporting what's gone on, right? And sometimes they will have very long form, kind of old school journalism that are also somewhat good. Do those get the most views and clicks and reads? I have no idea. But, do their op-ed sections. But I will see certain people online that there'll be that crazy, ridiculous op-ed that's out in like left field all the way. And that's what's getting reshared all day. It's just all day. Both sides are saying whatever they're saying. But that's not all of the New York Times. That's not all the Washington Post. That's some person on the op-ed section.
So, okay, a few things. First
Uh-huh.
of all, it's not fair to compare the New York Times reporting to Tucker Carlson. You have to compare it to
Yes.
Harris Faulkner, who is
Yes.
an incredible newswoman. I
That's
mean,
fair. Yes.
and
Yes.
and that's the first point, right? Is that
Right.
the news during the day on Fox is it's good. I'm sorry, but it is.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
good.
I've seen it. Yeah. It's not bad.
Number two, the question is not only what they cover, it's what they don't cover. Okay. It's the fact that they don't cover crime. It's the fact that they don't cover issues that are relevant to working class life. They don't cover labor. They don't, it's what they're choosing to do. The third point is like, yes, the further they get from American politics, the more truthy it sounds, the more reliable it sounds, right? It's very hard to read. Like their coverage of the Trump administration, I think was really a travesty. If you supported
Yes.
Trump, you couldn't read it, right? Like nobody
Yes.
I know
Yes.
who
Yes.
voted for Trump could read that stuff. It was
100%.
totally voicey. It was really unacceptable.
I agree with
But
you.
so then you're like, okay, the further away they get from that, the better it is. But you read their coverage of England, it's terrible. Like people who, British people will tell you the same thing who are center right. Like they're like, it's unreadable. I read the stuff from Israel. I can tell you the same thing. Any area that you know very well, you'll be able to point to what we can do about America, which is everything they're not covering, the tone, the editorializing. Like it's really, and the reason they do that is because Dean Baquet, the executive editor, is being held hostage by people in his own newsroom who have huge Twitter followings who will literally like slag off their own colleagues if they don't call Trump racist enough times in this one article. So it's not just the op-ed pages. It really is across the board. Immigration, the border, like just like everything that they won't talk about when it's inconvenient, because they know that if they do, somebody, if they talk about something in a way that somebody doesn't like, somebody could get fired, So I sort of a little bit resist that. Now, I do think the Times has realized this. They hired John McWhorter, for example, to write a newsletter. That's an incredible sign, move in the right direction. There have been 3 articles about crime. So, I'm thrilled to see those. They've been covering children who are dying in public housing, which was like taboo a year ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago. So I do think they've realized the problem, and I'm really thrilled to see that, and I'm sort of really paying attention to that. But I just have to bring this up, but on Jewish issues,
Oh, yeah.
they freaking they said that rabbis made AOC cry last week, rabbis, influential, powerful rabbis. And it's they have a history of this. And it's just as a Jewish person, it's impossible not to, it's so upsetting to see the paper of record putting its imprimatur on the most obvious anti-Semitic tropes. And so it's I'm obviously very invested in the New York Times. It's obviously had a problem with Jews since its inception, actually. But it's very hard, and the fact that doesn't register to anyone else, nobody cares, you couldn't, it's very hard to be dispassionate specifically on that topic, on that issue. There was earlier this year, there were people beating up Jews in the streets over this whole thing with the last conflict between Hamas and Israel. And the New York Times called them clashes. And it was that day, after I don't know how many 25 years of being a subscriber, that I unsubscribed. I said, "You're calling a pogrom clashes? What is this, 1939 Germany? Have you no shame to speak that way about it's and I'm glad that happened after I finished writing my book, because I can say I did my best to be dispassionate about this subject. And
Sure.
but it's just very hard to can you imagine if there was if a group of white supremacists went, attacked a group of Black people in the street in 12 different cities in America, and the New York Times called it clashes.
Yeah. No.
I don't know. And the only person who covers these things, I'm going to say again, Harris Faulkner, out there being why are Jews being beaten up in the streets? And it's you won't get that in the mainstream liberal media because of this sort of what I call wokeness, this racial moral panic that has Jews on the wrong side of it. Anyway, I'm sorry. I try not to talk about that because it's it sounds very.
No, it's totally fine. I do have a question about that, but let me just go back to your first point, right? Or the other point you were making. So you're saying about I'm gonna be even more contrarian here. So you're right, and I agree with you that having sometimes an error of omission is sometimes worse than commission, right? What they're not talking about. Absolutely, right? Big omission error. I hear you loud and clear, and I agree with you. That doesn't mean that what they are talking about, though, I just see them as two different arguments. I think they're both important, and I agree with you. I think they need to talk about those issues.
I concede that. You're right. I overstated, and you're right. I mean, look, it's true. The New York Times does still sometimes fact check, but then they stealth edited that piece about rabbis, making AOC cry. They didn't put a correction, right? So it's like, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not, like the whole thing with the Tom Cotton op-ed where there's like a huge correction about things that are actually true, that they're like, this is not true, like that's ridiculous. They, so it's I hear what you're saying. Yeah, you're right. Like, yeah, the standard still to some extent is still higher for whatever that's, worth for.
So I'll say but I will say this.
Yeah, I don't. But is it real? Sorry, now I'm like outraged.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Like, is it really like if you're like a person who lives in public housing and for decades, the paper that is supposed to be the paper of record in your city, it is more dangerous to live in your neighborhood than in Uganda, and like they will not cover the murders that are happening outside your window every day, or like the children who are being sexually abused, or like is it really to omit that, is it really like less bad than a culture war, than Harris Faulkner getting upset about critical race theory in schools? Like, I don't know. I have to say, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right, and I'm wrong.
Well, I don't have an answer either. I mean, I think, I'm the centrist here, right? I'm the center lefty. I mean, I wanted to talk about that stuff and give a small amount to culture war stuff and let society and culture figure that out. I don't like that either, but I don't think it means that fair play to Fox News. I do know that they have really good guests on. I know that they'll do good reporting on a lot of this stuff. The problem is that they have, I'm sure you know this. I mean, the history of Fox News, why that place was created, the whole history of Roger Ailes is, just not the best characters. And it's hard sometimes when the whole enterprise and institution is founded on lots. I mean, this is a channel on all hours of the day, ran stories talking about how President Obama was a socialist Muslim. That was all the time on Fox News, and many things, many things. Now, I don't actually hate Fox News. I think it is what it is. It's fine. I don't really watch mainstream media, so I don't have a dog in the fight, but I don't hate Fox News. I do think that it's basically the inverse problem of the New York Times. New York Times has a lot of reputation, a lot of esteem, right? And that's the history of it. It starts that way. It was a very elitist kind of thing. And now it's completely watered down. Now I can say, and what
started as a critique of sensationalism, right? And now it is sensational.
And now that's right. Yeah. Right. Yes. That's not to say that they don't have, if I look at the front page or the major sections, if I want to read what's going on in the world, yes, I can get that. I don't want to see, how we're probably not going to pass an infrastructure bill. I can read that in the New York Times and Washington Post. Okay, fine. Stuff like that. But they're not, their error of omission from what they are not reporting on, their obsession with certain sides of race issues, their abhorrent op-ed sections have made them the thing that they've been not created as. And then I think the inverse is true of Fox News. Fox News has a history and how they were founded with lots of sensationalism, lots of deception, not really good faith actors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I remember the time of Bill O'Reilly and just how awful a lot of that stuff was. But Now, because of the void that's left by some of the other places, they actually have good reporting sometimes. They actually will talk about things that other people aren't talking about. They actually will talk about working class issues. So there's a kind of flip-flop that's gone on with and I'm not trying to compare New York Times and Fox News. I know it kind of sounds like I'm doing that. These are just two examples of left and right kinds of things. But so all that said, I did want to ask this. I didn't plan on asking this, but why not? We're here. Can you, I cannot for the life of me, understand, and maybe I'm not asking you to be my, translator of this stuff, but maybe you have some ideas on this. Why did we see this past summer a strange alignment of the, let's just say, progressive left, or maybe not the extreme left, let me put it that way. Many folks that would, wear a Black Lives Matter shirt, very much about Black Lives Matter activism. Seemingly, when the Israeli-Palestinian crisis flared up again, I saw many people on the extreme left absolutely, with no abandon, vehemently siding with Palestinians.
With Hamas.
Yes, fair point. With Hamas, that's a fair point. I couldn't understand that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not Jewish. I'm not Palestinian. I think it's terrible. I have friends on both sides. I don't need to pick a side. I just don't. It's not my country. It's not my people group. It's not my area. I don't understand this apps. It felt really weird to me and forced that I saw people that had never once in their life thought about or talked about these issues publicly making the most over the top stand with Hamas and all that. And I couldn't get it. How do you make sense of that? How did you understand it? I don't understand it. I mean, that's fine if you, fine. I mean, people are going to do what they want. You're going to have your opinions about whatever. We can all admit it's a complicated situation. But just I don't know a lot about this, but I'm going to be on this side and I got to pick us. I just didn't understand that. It was week after week after week. I'm seeing this. I'm like, no one's saying you got to pick a side here. Why are you like, I didn't understand it. I mean, what do you make of that? I couldn't get it.
So the problem with with the left today is that it is enthralled to a moral panic around race. I call it wokeness, which is what happens when white liberals perpetuate a moral panic, and meaning, like, instead of saying we need police reform, they're saying we need to talk about race in every single situation, in every conversation. And you can't turn on NPR without hearing a conversation about race within the first 30 seconds. And like everything has to be front and center in every conversation. That's what makes it a moral panic. It's the foregrounding of race as the be all and end all. And you're a racist. It's the Kendi formula. You're either an anti-racist or a racist, meaning you have to be actively talking about race all the time to avoid being called a racist, right? It's a moral panic. Because of course there's still issues of racism in America, sure, but yeah, nowhere near what this would, what this predicts. And also this whole moral panic is completely overshooting the problems. It's basically a rebranding of racism to the thing that it would most appeal to white liberals to fight, right? They don't actually want to deal with like the education system and the fact that 40% of Baltimore children have a 1.0 GPA, right? Like that's fine with them, as long as like we can talk about how many, people of color in the New York Philharmonic, like it's impossible to imagine that maybe like, maybe people don't want to be in the New York Philharmonic, whatever, the moral panic around race. Anti-Zionism is just wokeness Middle East edition. It's just the same stupidity, the same immoral, dehumanizing stupidity transferred to Israel-Palestine. So what happens is in America, the binary is white versus black, right? Everybody else gets, put into one of those categories, right? Mm-hmm. And so what they did is they look at the Middle East, they're like, oh, the Jews there are white, which is not true. 60% of Israeli Jews are people of color. Right. They're like, the Palestinians are, the black people, which is not true. The Palestinians are a nationality. They are in a national conflict with Israelis, not a racial one.
Right.
And so they see in the Palestinians avatars of the Black struggle in America. Of course, it's like completely false, right? The Palestinian, like the problem with racism in America is that Black people are pure victims of white supremacy when it existed here, and the remnants of it as it persists today. They are pure victims of what was state-sponsored violence and the ways in which we're failing to completely eradicate it, although I think we've come very far. The Palestinians have a lot of agency in the conflict. There's a lot of terrorism. They started the last conflict. There was an intifada 20 years ago. 1,053 Israelis were killed. That would be the equivalent of if 20 years ago, over the course of 4 years, 50,000 Americans were killed by terrorist attacks. Okay? Like, that's not... To compare that to the Black struggle in America is so unbelievably disgusting to the descendants of slaves and what they've been through. It's so gross. And I mean, routinely, the intersectional language betrays the descendants of slaves by comparing their struggle to like the struggle of gay rights. Like, give me a break. Like, come on, Anyway, so basically they took this moral panic paradigm, and because it's a panic, you have to talk about it. You have to show you're on the right side. They imported it. And the problem with this way of thinking is not only that it's dehumanizing by asking us to look to people's race before their humanity, it's that it takes powerlessness as the only moral virtue. And only the powerless are allowed to have an opinion. So if that's how you see things, you look at Israel, Hamas has less power than Israel, it's true. So they become the arbiters of virtue, this like terrorist organization that throws gay people off of the roofs of buildings, and that, women are literally not allowed to leave the house without a male guardian. And they become the arbiters of morality because they have less power than the people that they have attacked with their rockets. It's ridiculous. And but I don't find it mysterious at all. Like, I could have, in fact, I did predict it in my book. And then when it happened, it was devastating. But I kept being like, why are you so devastated? This is literally what you said in your book. It's like the Middle East edition of wokeness, and it's totally dehumanizing, totally wrong. And yet, like, people are so high on their own supply. And a lot of times we talk about this like as though like people will ask like, oh, they talk about it like it's anti-Semitic, and it's like, that's not the problem with it. Like, the problem with it is that it's stupid. The problem with it is that it's like it's dumb, it's wrong. It's like that's the problem with it. It's like, why do we have to even go there? I mean, I don't think these people are necessarily coming at it from like an anti-Jewish racist point of view. They're just wrong. They are enthralled to a worldview that is deeply, deeply problematic, like very dehumanizing, and really bad for people of color.
Yeah, to me, I didn't really say anything public about it just because, again, it's an extremely complicated issue. It's something that is devastating for the innocent civilians that are there in that region. And what the hell do I know? I mean, it's, again, to me, when people do that, it's this absolute just American narcissism of, we have to just overlay our issues and just translate that everywhere in the world, which is fucking awful. Like, I would be so annoyed if I was other places in the world of like, look, you guys got your own problems. That's fine. I hate comparative suffering. I think that's ridiculous. And we have our own stuff. And like, sure, if you want to, be aligned or donate or whatever it is for a certain side or group, that's your choice. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, but don't try to map it on or layer it on to like your shit. Like, everyone's got their own shit. Like, and again, I could see kind of what you're saying, the spillover, but again, it's still, I don't know. I'm just still kind of taken aback by it.
Anyone do it? Yeah.
Yeah. It just really, I don't know. It's, I'm not necessarily surprised, but I just still, I get taken aback by it.
Yeah.
Okay. So last bit here, I have two or three kind of final questions about where we go, right? Where do we go in the future, right? There's a lot of bad, and there's a lot of things we probably didn't get to, but, so the first thing is, what about individual journalists that, look, they just like journalism. And maybe they just like the old school journalism and they got into it and they have a big interest and passion. And they don't want to play in this nonsense. They just want to report the news, have perspectives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I don't think it's right or fair to, when people say, well, all of media sucks or all of it's bad. It's like, okay, I can understand where people come from, but there's a lot of really good individual reporters out there, a lot of really good individual journalists out there that they don't like. Maybe at the place they work at. I'm sure there's plenty of people at the Atlantic or the New Yorker or other places that they don't like that stuff. It's just like there's stuff that no one likes at their job that they just, you know, they still do good work, but they don't, you know, they're not running the show. It's not their company. So what do I guess we say to individual journalists that maybe work in these institutions that aren't that way and they're just trying to do a good job? And second, these are kind of related, which is, I don't know how you feel about this, but how do we save institutions and not simply just have a million Substacks? Because I don't think that is a tenable solution for the problem. And I don't think that's a way to progress in the future of just basically, you know, newsletters and blogs of the person that you like, you know, that's all funded by Patreon. I mean, I think there's a place for that, but I do think personally there's a space of, we do need journalistic institutions that are ethical and moral and have some balance and can have certain sides. So what do we talk about with the individual journalists in certain places, and how do we save some of the institutions if at all possible?
I would say, like, I'll be honest, like, to me, the biggest problems in the world right now are not being covered at all. And so I feel so, like, despondent about that. Like, what are the biggest problems in the world? Like, okay, there's an actual genocide happening in China, in Xinjiang. And like, instead of writing about that, there are all these journalists writing about like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's just like not changing that much. And like, it's in a stalemate. And like, it's like, what, like, really, like, that's like, there's an actual genocide happening. And instead they want to just go somewhere else where it's sexy and accuse somebody of making a genocide. It's not even happening. Like, and you can't, who is covering Xinjiang? It's like, who is even talking about that? Or like I said, you know, like, you know, Baltimore schools, you know, or children being sexually abused in low income neighborhoods, in public housing. Like, there's an epidemic of this happening. And like, you can't get anybody to talk about this stuff. And so I feel a little bit like every time I see an article in the Atlantic or the New Yorker on a woke topic, you know what I mean? I feel like you've spent all of these resources and all of this time investigating this thing that's like, it's just not the most pressing issue. Or like, okay, I know this is gonna, you know, a lot of your listeners are gonna disagree with me about this, but like the moral panic around climate change, like just the amount of ink that's spilled on that topic that is so clearly about raising money for Democratic politicians has nothing to do with like the lives of working class Americans. Like, people be like, oh, what about the economic injustice aspect of like climate change? Like, yeah, there are neighborhoods that are hotter because of that. Like that's not, like, every time you write an article about that, you're not doing anything to help those people. You're not doing anything to change the makeup of America. Like, so I feel like, you know, when I think about the areas that these institutions are willing to invest money in investigative reporting, it's very rarely on the topics that, like, just walking around my neighborhood, I'm like, nobody's talking about this, nobody's talking about that. And like, so I feel a little bit like, you know, I don't know, or like qualified immunity is another good example. Like, we obviously need like massive police reform. Like, obviously the police have a problem with racism. The data shows they don't actually shoot Black people more than they shoot unarmed Black people more than unarmed white people, but they insult them more, they lay hands on them more, they push them up against walls more, they put them in handcuffs more. I mean, just the fact that they insult them more is so horrific. Like, it is so unbelievably horrific that there is a group in America that gets insulted more by the people who are supposed to be protecting them. Nobody writes about that. Instead, they're writing about the thing that is not actually worse. For some reason, when they finally reach for their gun, they don't pull the trigger more often against Black people. We don't know why that is. That's just what the data shows. It's like, so there are like, you know, like thousands and thousands of articles about, you know, George Floyd and police shootings, which is like, yeah, it's important. We have to talk about that stuff. It is important, but that is a low income problem. They're dressing it up as a racial problem when the racial problem is that they insult them more. Like, How dare they? Like, how dare they? But nobody's writing about that stuff. Like, nobody's, and what are they calling for? Like, nobody's talking about, okay, how do you get people to stop insulting them? Like, how do you deal with that? Like, I don't know, maybe try paying them $100,000 a year and giving them really good benefits. Like, if you had a job where you were making $100,000 a year, you wouldn't walk around insulting people. You'd actually like want to keep that job. You'd have like customer service. I don't know, we're like the country of customer service. I don't know, like stuff like this, like where it's like, I feel despondent about like what the big problems are and then what the topics that get attention are. Like, obviously, okay, everybody feels this way, like that their pet issues, you know, like are not,
Sure.
I don't know, like, okay, the fact that like 84% of juvenile offenders are functionally illiterate. So those 40% of Baltimore children who have a 1.0 GPA, they like 84% of them, right, are going to end up in juvenile detention. Like, how are we okay with just throwing away children's lives? Like, I don't know. So I feel like I feel when I see these major outlets, like what are they willing to cover and what are they not willing to cover? Like crime, like this huge spike in murder over the last year. Murder, like children being freaking murdered, and like nobody's writing about it, nobody cares about it. Like, how is that okay? Like, so that thing, I feel like you know, that is very much about who's writing the journalism and who they're writing it for. And like, you know, why would somebody living on the Upper West Side care about like how many children are being murdered in, you know, St. Louis or whatever. In terms of institutions, I do have to say, like I said, it is heartening to see the New York Times seems to have copped to what the problem is. I don't know how good they're going to be at solving it, but like if I was in charge of a major news organization, I would say like, you know, reporters are not allowed to tweet. Like I would just say you're not allowed to be on Twitter. Like, you know, we have that covered from our end. Like we're not, and we have a standard inside. You have to you have to appoint somebody to be the executive editor who has the stones to say like, I decide what's good journalism, not you with your 250,000 followers on Twitter. I decide. And really stands by like what it means to be, you know, there are parts of the New York Times that are great. I think the daily podcast is really good because I think that there is, you know, I think Michael Barbaro has a sense of like what journalism is. And like, it doesn't seem very much, from what I can tell from the coverage, it's the one place you will hear Trump voters interviewed in the whole New York Times where nobody will imply that they're racist. Like the only place seems to be, you know, the daily podcast. So I would say like, you know, staying away from Twitter. Michael Barbaro, I never see him tweeting. You know, I think he really stays away from it. Like I would, you know, setting up those standards, what they are, and then really it's very easy to get a working class readership. You just have to talk about those people, talk to them, talk about them, represent their values, represent their views, represent religious people, you know, like don't act like, you know, there's something wrong with them or that they're stupid or illiterate. Like, and yeah, I think, you know, I think a little bit of dumbing down is great. Like why is everything like the class chasm in America is about education as much as it is about income. And it's just like, why are we creating information that cannot be consumed by people of a lower class? That they literally, within the first sentence, there's something that's like signals to them, like, this is not for you. Like, I don't know, like hire people from working class backgrounds, hire reporters who didn't go to college. You cannot teach reporting. You can't teach someone how to be a journalist. You can't teach someone how to listen. You can't teach someone how to question your authority, your biases. But what I can tell you is that what they're learning in colleges today is how to reaffirm their own biases. You know, it's pure confirmation bias. So I would say like, you know, like let's focus on class a little bit and see where that gets us. What we're missing in America right now is a fundamental concept of the common good. It's a thing that binds us together as a nation. You know, like anything any individual does to counteract that, anytime you become the person in someone's life who is a good person who disagrees with them, you're sewing back together that frayed texture that we've lost, you know, that infrastructure, that, so, you know, that emotional, spiritual infrastructure that we've lost. And I, you know, I would just urge your listeners to do that. Be the person in someone's life who they disagree with, who is a good person. Like that, that is how you deprogram people. And it like works 100% of the time. You're not going to change their minds, but that's not the point. The point is to make it so that we are a nation, once again, united in our diversity.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I want to make one final point about the class thing, but just on that last point you were saying, you know, I have a very nihilistic viewpoint on this. You know, I think the only way you change hearts and minds, right? The only way you change opinions is by fostering some. You don't have to have a big, deep, intimate relationship, but we only do that through the relationship. That's the vehicle in which to do that, right? Where they see that you're another person, that you're a human being, and that it's not just a constellation of wrong ideas on the other side or something like that. The problem, the issue for many reasons is scaling that. And I just don't think we can scale that very well. And it's frustrating because it is a very conversation by conversation kind of thing. So we just need a bunch of people doing that kind of system. But I think the only way that scales is when you have national tragedy or the remnants of war. That's where people come together mostly. But it's a very cynical outlook. But people aren't in mass being convinced by big ideas or issues. Sometimes, but very, very rarely. And I think it depends on each individual person, which gives some worth, some value to try and make that connection. I just want to make a finer point, because you've said it throughout the whole conversation, which I firmly agree with you on, is this working class issue. Mm-hmm. And I think more important than anything else, race, gender, education, healthcare, all that stuff is super important. Super, super, super important. But I do think this class issue is the kind of thread that runs through all of that. And I think it's important. I've talked about it at different points on the podcast with different people, but you've mentioned it a lot. So I'll just say this. We have to have a more genuinely diverse way of discussing working class, because working class is Black people, white people, brown 100%. People, Asian people, 100%. Native Americans, and I'll just
Jews even.
Yeah, Jews. I'll pick on my own group. One of the reasons why the left and Democrats as a party are just completely, to this day, still befuddled at how Latinos all across the country could have voted in an increase in 2020 for Trump is because they have a very cartoonish caricature of what Latinos are and aren't, and completely ignorant about different ways of immigration and what that looks like, where, based on each country, it's going to be a little different, but there is a thread, mostly a religious thread, a very working class, conservative thread, and you come to the land of opportunity to have that. But each country is a little different, and you have now generations of Latinos that are here, which is also very different. So it's okay. Well, why are Latinos in Miami and Southern Florida voting for Trump way more? That's not very hard to understand if you know anything about Cuba and anything about conservative Latinos. Okay, well, why are Latinos then in Arizona and Nevada? Why are they voting for Biden? Again, which generation of Latinos? Where it's very different for folks over there. Which countries of origins are they coming from? Again, in I think West Texas, why were they more Latinos voting for Trump? And I sometimes I just kind of get my thoughts on paper and I throw it up on Medium, and I wrote a small thing about how it's better to conceptualize Latinos as part of the working class, and they have many things that are analogous to white working class people than you would not realize if you just listen to people squawking at someone about immigration and the border all the time. Most Latinos don't really give a shit about that. I mean, they care about it nominally, but I don't think that because they're Latino, they care about it more than, someone else. And so I think I'm just using it as an example to say that people have to understand what working class means. And that legitimately is the thread that runs through and or transcends racial categories. And so you could look at it in a way of saying, well, somebody that is Black in the working class and white in the working class and Latino in the working class are going to have way more in common than the color of their skin. And it doesn't, that's not to say that those race issues aren't important. They're supremely important, I think. But there are some things that connect someone And most people are going to be connected by their geographical region than by what, racial group or category, ethnicity they're part of. Not to say it's not important, but that I have to care more about my neighbors that live next to me and the ones in the town over and then the ones in the big city or whatever than, the people that live in Baltimore. I love Baltimore. I, grew up around there. But, I only have a certain, bucket that I can fill of how much emphasis I can care on. I'm going to always care around kind of where I'm living at, my region, which most people do. That's not abnormal. And I think when we understand that and we understand the true complexity of what working class means and see that first and foremost, in a sense, I think you'll have a more nuanced, balanced, and robust view of things in terms of how we deal with some of these issues. And I just said a few things there. Anything you want to say to follow up on that, or anything that you?
No, I just could not agree with you more, and I really appreciate you saying that. You should write that up as an op-ed for Newsweek because that's really important and interesting, and we just don't hear that point of view enough. And I completely agree with you.
Yeah, no, that's. It's nice to know that when some people, I can sometimes make sense to people. Okay, so the book is called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. I greatly enjoyed it. Batya, thank you so much for coming on. It's been such a blast. You're lovely. And where can people find you? Where can they get the book and all that good stuff?
The book is available for sale on Amazon and at encounterbooks.com if you're not an Amazon person. And you can find important op-eds by working class Americans at newsweek.com. And I'm on Twitter as well. And yeah, I hope if you buy the book, you enjoy it. I hope you keep listening to Javier's podcast because he's wonderful. And wow, thank you so much for having me. This was really, really a delight.
No, seriously, delight was all mine. You're much nicer than I could have anticipated. It's always nice reading people's stuff and following them, and then you meet them in person, and sometimes you don't know. So, no, it's great. I love all of your thoughts, and I love all of the conversation, and so I hope people enjoy it. So, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
All right.